Okay, well, it's 6 o'clock and good evening and welcome to the presentation tonight, sharing our airspace resources. I'm Terry Connaughton. I'm the director of the downtown Spartanburg Airport, also a flight instructor. Joining me tonight, I have Sarah Solverby out of the downtown Greenville Airport, who's also a flight instructor. Also tonight, we have Melanie from the South Carolina Aviation Association, who'll be doing the media in the background and helping us with this PowerPoint presentation. So I'd like to begin with a few things I'll be reviewing tonight. So Melanie, if you do the next slide, please. So the background is I'm going to be doing a review of the regulations and the Airman's Information Manual. And then I'm going to take you in a view from the cockpit flying as a VFR student or an experienced pilot in this area. Some of the airports we're reviewing tonight in these particular scenarios will be flying into the Greenville-Spartanburg area, GSP. Donaldson, GYH, and downtown Greenville. The reason for this presentation is that these three airports are very close together and there's a very complex airspace over the upstate in South Carolina. And unfortunately, many people become disorientated or actually bust airspace or basically get into the trouble when they fly up in this area. So what I've done here, I've put together a presentation to try and break out some of the errors and some of the areas you've got to look out for when you're flying in this area. So the next slide, please, Melanie. So first of all, some of the ground rules. You look at here, it talks about 91.3, the responsibility and authority of pilot in command. So when you're flying around in the upstate in South Carolina, you are responsible, you are the pilot in command. And you're basically responsible at the final authority for this particular flight around the area. So if you have an in-flight emergency, that type of thing, you're expected to make those right decisions. But really what happens is that if you make any deviation from your attended flight, you are required by the administrator to make actually a written report. So what this does, this puts the direct responsibility on you as a pilot flying around in this complex airspace. So don't take it too lightly. It's a lot of responsibility in flying controlled airspace, especially in a congested area like this. Next slide, please, Melanie. So here we have 91.103. This is the catch-all. As it says here, each pilot in command shall, before beginning a flight, become familiar with all information concerning that flight. This information must include the following. It goes on and talks about if you're under IFR or VFR, knowing about the airports, the weathers, the fuel requirements, all the information about the flight, the lengths of runways, and the type of airplane you're flying. So again, it's putting the ownership on you to make sure that you follow this. And so what can't happen is that if you fly into an incorrect airspace or bust an airspace, that's going to be your responsibility in doing that. And so it's very, very important. You know exactly what you're getting yourself into before you take off and launch in this area. So pre-flight action is really the number one important thing that you really make sure you take care of before you start flying in this area. Next slide, please. So, Class C airspace around Greer. It's very important to understand, and where sometimes the confusion gets in place, is that everyone understands that in talking to Greer airspace or Class C airspace, you must have at least two-way communication. And that's where it gets a little bit gray, because the possibility that a Greer or Class C airspace comes back and say, aircraft calling Greer standby, does not mean you are allowed to enter the Class C airspace. It's only when they're actually giving you your tail number. So for instance, they come back and say, Cessna 52344 standby, at least you can actually go ahead and enter the airspace. But it's very, very important. You must have that call sign given back to you before you can enter the airspace. Otherwise, that could be considered an actual airspace violation. So that's rule number one in the Class C airspace. The next slide is Melanie. Same true as Class D. Same situation here. You must have operable two-way of communication. So what's interesting about this is that when you're flying into the Greer airspace here, or Class C airspace, there's also going to be 3 Class D airspaces within this airspace itself. And what happens is that Class C will hand you over to Class D to know you're coming. So the important thing is that you are maintaining two-way communication with Class C, and as you transition into Class D, you're also making the same type of communication, making sure that's done. Okay, next slide, please, Melanie. Okay, as you see here, if you're flying in the upstate, this is how it looks outside the window, flying at about maybe 4,000 or 5,000 feet. You can just make out there to the left GYH, which is Donaldson. A little further north, you may locate GMU. Then to the right of that is GSP. And as you can see, all three airports are very, very close together. Okay, next slide, please, Melanie. And as you can see, once you start putting the airspace above that, it becomes pretty complex. And you can see how they overlap and on top of each other. And you need to know exactly where you are in relationship as you're flying through this airspace. And that's really the only way you can see it, three-dimensional way that way, in the Greenville area. Next slide, please. So how about approaching from the south at 3,000 feet to land at any of the upstate airports? As you're flying in as a regular pilot, this is the type of view you're going to have outside your cockpit. Next slide, Melanie. And this is what you're flying into. So a student who's on a cross-country flight, coming from the southern part of the state, flying into the upstate, is confronted with a section that looks like this. And as you can see, looking at the section here, it's pretty complex. You can see you've got the Class C airspace, you've got a runway there indicating in the middle, that's obviously longer than 8,000 feet, and you've got two Class D two airports to the left of that. And it's important to know exactly where you are in relationship to those airspaces as you fly in here. Pretty complex. However, if you strip away some of those items, next slide, Melanie, we will notice then we've got a much more clean look here. You can now start seeing where these airports are located and what's going on. As you can see in the middle there, you've got pretty much GSP. To the southwest there, you've got GMU. Further south, you've got Donaldson. And as you can see, those circles around there are actual their airspaces. And you can see Donaldson there is actually clipped a little bit by GMU. There's also on the chart indications of what their altitudes are. However, there's a catch-22 there. Some of the altitudes indicated on those charts aren't always correct, because some of these airports have a thing called letters of intent, or letters of recommendation, or letters of agreement, which allows these airspaces to say, well, in this situation, your airspace is only this high. And unfortunately, you're only going to find that out if you start digging into things called the NOTAMs. So it's a good idea to dig into some of these airports and information and find out what the NOTAMs are, and what these letters of agreement are going to be, to truly understand where these actual airspace is. And next slide, Melanie. Okay, let's talk about GSP. So what I did is I went around to each airport and I asked them, what keeps you up at night as an air traffic controller? And they had many things to talk about, but I asked the guys over at GSP first. And some of the things they said was, the first thing was that always let GSP know if you're a student pilot. So if you're flying into the airspace here in the upstate, and you're going to fly through Class C, over to Class D, always tell them you're a student pilot, because that way they can give you a little bit more help in making sure that you're doing the right thing. Because what they're concerned about is that if you're flying in for the very first time, you may get confused between Donaldson and GMU because they're so close together. What they will do, they will keep a pretty good close eye on you in flying through their airspace. At that particular point, I handed over to Sarah. Sarah, do you see also students getting confused between possibly flying inside Donaldson or GMU?
We hear it pretty often, unfortunately, to the point that Greer has started, asking pilots that are flying into GMU, are you familiar with the area? Do you have all three airports in sight? Report Greenville and Donaldson in sight. So it's happened often enough for Greer to start prompting pretty much anybody that comes inbound to make sure they've got the correct airport in sight.
Right, exactly. So that's why if you're a student pilot, they want to know to say, hey, I'm going to take care of you, make sure you get the right airport in sight. Because as you can imagine, it can be very difficult, a bad situation, if you're approaching an airport on the wrong frequency. You can imagine the type of problems that would cause. So it's very, very important that you make sure you get the right airport in sight. The northeast of GSP is a busy approach area, and that's where a lot of jets are getting let down, especially on runway 22 approach. So typically they like to keep you anywhere between below 6,000 or maybe a little bit above 3,000, that corridor there, because that's where they actually intentionally let down a lot of airplanes to come in and land on runway 22. So if you're flying north of downtown Spartanburg area or south of Rutherfordton, or up there near the Fairview area, it's important that you maintain some of those altitudes and be very, very wary of some of the traffic being let down. So even if you're not actually in Class C, I would highly recommend getting flight following. Again, all the flight following is going to do, provide radar services and allow ATC to talk to you about what's going on in your area and the possibility of a jet that could be coming across the top of you, and it could cause some situation of wake turbulence. So again, flight following is a really good radar services flying anywhere around the upstate and around GSP. Next slide, Melanie. Get the next slide, Melanie. Here we go. Okay, so look at NOTAMs then. This is Greer Tower, letter to airman. Okay, sorry, Melanie, get back one again. You jumped there a little bit. We have here some information about the agreements between these airports here, and there's some information there about it. So it talks about VFR arrivals and departures from Donaldson Field here. It talks about, again, Donaldson Field is in the close proximity of the Greenville Downtown Airport Class D airspace in the outer ring. Okay, it talks about where these airports are laying to the north, the approach courses, and part to the east. It talks about here, VFR pilots not receiving radar services from Greer should be aware of the following, because again, these flight following rules are voluntary. You don't have to have them. So they're pointing out a few things to be aware of here. It talks about GMU and Class D airspace immediately north of Donaldson. It talks about some of the departure, we're going to shortly. It talks about Class C airspace, the very proximity of the outer ring of aircraft approaching and making sure you maintain two-way communication. It talks about IFR traffic inbound to GMU runway 1, descending through a certain altitude, but also encroach or get very low into GMU airspace and Class D airspace, causing a potential conflict. So as you can see here, there's lots of information about these are things you need to know if you're not going to use flight following to be aware of coming in there. And as you can see, if you miss one of these things or not aware of it, it could cause a lot of problems. So again, letters of airmen like this are available to each individual airport under the NOTAMs. So I highly recommend looking at some of these NOTAMs to understand exactly what's going on in that airspace. Now the next slide, Melanie. Okay, let's talk about GYH, Donaldson. So the first thing is, if you ever talk to folks over at Donaldson, the very first thing they're going to tell you is that we do not have radar. Okay, so they're a Class D airport, and they haven't got any radar. So they said that if you're flying VFR over or around their airspace, just call them up and let them know so they can work with local traffic around you. So if you're flying south of Donaldson, not using flight following and not talking to anybody, it'd be a good idea still to contact them and let them know where you are. Okay, very important. You need to add to that, Sarah, as far as your experience in dealing with Donaldson.
Yeah, the Donaldson controllers are exceptionally helpful, always have been, but they are very willing to help, even if you're, trying to transition through to go to GMU from the south, or if you're, practicing maneuvers down below the airspace, even if you're out of their airspace, it helps them to know about it if they're launching, C-130s or charter jets or something in and out, and they don't know that you're there. There's nothing really they can do if you're in the way. So they do like when we tell them, hey, we're going to be over here, a couple little points that they like us to point out, or if we're on one side or another of 85, they like to know if we're coming over the rock quarry or not. Just the few little VFR waypoints that are listed on the sectional that helps them, I guess, pinpoint where we are a little easier.
Right. Yeah. Also to note, you may notice on here, there's actually a helipad just to the left of Donaldson, and that's fairly busy. And what happens a lot of times when traffic's there in the pattern, they have very active helicopter activity on that west side of the airport there. And like I say, it's a fairly busy heliport. I'm not sure if it's military or medical or what it is, but they're very, very busy, and they do work that obviously from the control tower. And next slide, Melanie. So let's talk about some of the things Sarah just mentioned. So if you're approaching Donaldson from the south, and you call up Donaldson, you say, Donaldson Tower, Cessna 52344, I'm 10 miles southwest of the airport inbound for landing. They can't see you. And so they got no radar. So squawking or pressing ident's not going to help them. So as Sarah pointed out, they like to use VFR reference points. And some of them they've used in the past is obviously the gravel pit, which is to the west of the airport. With what's known as the 85 control connector inbound. And flying over that, that's a pretty good indication of where you're at. Because what happens at that point is they break out the binoculars and are looking for your landing line. Once they see you, then they're going to go ahead and give you a sequence to go ahead and land on the runway that's actually being used. And one thing you should have to remember as a student pilot or a fairly new pilot, that if you're flying into a control tower across the airspace, you may be given either left downwind or right downwind. So expect both. Make sure you practice those things. But as you see here, the report connector inbound is about 2 miles out. And as far as they're concerned, it's a perfect reminder to turn your landing lights on, simply because that way they can see you then with their binoculars and then give you permission to go ahead and come in and land or set you up for a landing on one of their runways. Okay? The next slide, please, Melanie.
Terry, if I may, we had a question come in, and I think it's relevant to what you're talking about now.
Yeah.
Have there been any IFR arrivals on a visual approach into GSP confuse GYH runway 5 with GSP runway 4 and land at the wrong airport?
I personally haven't experienced it, but I would probably have a guess, and I would say yes. Maybe Sarah, have you noticed or heard of any situations where you had VFR landing on the wrong airport?
I haven't seen anybody actually come in and land. We've had a couple pilots misidentify GMU for Donaldson or GSP for GMU, but I haven't seen anybody come on in and land. It's usually caught before that.
Yeah. We get situations where, you know, they can't see you and they say, well, we can't see you yet, so report, you know, downwind. And they report downwind, they still can't see you. And they say, no, we still can't see you. And they say, well, okay, report base. And by that time, they found out a completely different airport. You know, and that's where the problem is, because now you're communicating to Donaldson but landing at GMU, and that's where, you know, it really gets into a problem. So yeah, I would imagine it's happened in the past, but I haven't actually experienced it. So good question. Next slide, Melanie. Okay, so let's imagine then we're flying in from the east and we're heading over to GM Donaldson to do some touch and goes at the friendly ATC facility. It's important then you make sure you have the correct runway in sight, because what's going to happen is if you're flying through Greer airspace, Greer will give you flight following through their airspace, and then they will say something like, you know, Cessna 5344, you're 10 miles from the airport, airport now 12 o'clock, confirm that you have it, you know, frequency change to prove, and they'll go ahead and put you over to the control frequency. What happens is this, next slide, Melanie. Okay, this is what GMY looks like coming in 2000 MSL, coming in from the east. And the question I have, if you're looking at this picture, do you have the runway in sight? Unfortunately, people see a black line in front of them and say, yep, I've got it in sight. We also see like this tower there, looks like a little corn or actual aircraft tower. That isn't actually the runway, proper runway. So the next slide, Melanie. And as you get closer into it, you can see here how you can get confused. As you're probably aware, the yellows crosses on a runway means that you can't land there. So what happens is when you're arriving in from the east, you're going to find that Donaldson will give you the right traffic pattern for runway 5. Most of the time, they will give you that right downwind, okay, at runway 5. Now, unfortunately, some pilots who fly exclusively at an uncontrolled airports, as they say, are the usual victims here. They will automatically cross over the runway, the downwind end, and start doing a left downwind, because that's how they've been trained to do it over and over again in an uncontrolled field. So there's two problems here. Coming in, basically, you know, coming in from the east, first of all, you may misunderstand the right runway, start doing a left or right downwind on a closed runway. And then what you may also do as a student pilot, possibly cross over to the other side and incorrectly enter a left downwind instead of a right downwind, onto runway 5. Melanie, have you seen that situation before? I mean, Sarah? Sorry.
Personally, I haven't. I'm sure it has happened before. I know one of our examiners, one of their go-to airports for the landing portion of the private pilot check ride is Donaldson, and they will take you south of Donaldson, do the maneuvers, and then line you up with that closed runway and kind of test your knowledge of or your ability to identify the correct runway. So I've seen that. I don't know if anybody's ever did what you just spoke of. I'm sure it's happened. I just haven't seen it.
Yeah. Don't be surprised also entering Donaldson's direction. You may have left and right track at the same time. And what the towers will do, they'll operate both sides of the runway and sequence you in. One may have to extend their downwind to let the other aircraft in. So you really have to be on your toes when that happens to make sure that you visually are aware where the other aircraft are and allow ATC to actually vect you in this situation here onto runway 5. Okay, next slide, Melanie. Okay, so close look here. So typically runway 5 is right traffic. It's the most frequent use for runway 5, and past the east given more room for the GMU or actual downtown Greenville airspace. And this is why they have you go in that direction. As we'll see in a second, to the right of us here, or to the north of us here, the GMU or the actual downtown Greenville airspace is really, really close to the end of the runway here. This is typically why they probably have you go ahead and do the right pattern. While remaining in the pattern here, you're required to stay at 1,800 feet, even though the sectional talks about how high that actual airspace is. They would typically keep you down low at 1,800 feet. And so the reason is because they have aircraft above you, possibly landing into Korea or into GMU. They always try and keep you low. And if you're departing that area, let's say you're departing the area on runway 23, departing to the south, they will always keep you below or about 1,800 feet until you're out of Class D airspace. And again, for that reason, you're actually flying below a lot of approaches going into GMU or GSP. Okay, next slide, Melanie. Okay, let's talk about some of the departures here a little bit. Talks about, in both sides, he really talks about here, they really want to keep you particularly below 1,800 feet, especially on the eastern side, because Donaldson, as you go around there, you've got a lot of overlying airspace here coming in. On the other side, it does show that it's 2,500 feet, but as I said before, then they're really going to go ahead and keep you at 1,800 feet. And this is because that Class D airspace altitude is actually based off the internal agreement between the surrounding airports. And that's why they have you fly so low there. So it's pretty helpful. Okay, the next slide. Okay, mentioned before that you're taking off runway 5 at Donaldson. You can see here, you have approximately about half a mile, okay, to make sure you can turn left or right on the airspace. If you turn right, you can see the problems you're going to run into. If you're still with Donaldson, talking to those guys, you could accidentally, very easily enter into Class C airspace and climbing. If you're going to turn left, very easily enter into GMU. So if you're ever at Donaldson, you're going to make sure that these turns are really, really tight taking off there. Otherwise, you'll be right into the wrong airspace very, very quickly and have an airspace infraction. Okay. Next slide. Okay, we'll talk about Sarah's home airport, GMU. Okay, this is how it looks from above. Pretty serene here. You can see the runway there, just in the middle there, as we're coming into it. So what's interesting about GYH, it's pretty tough to find in the daytime. It's even tougher to find at night. Why is that, Sarah? Why is it tough to find the airport at nighttime?
A good bit of congestion around us, so all the lights blend in with the airport. It is very difficult to find at night.
It is. The light pollution is pretty bad. We're fortunate over here in downtown Spartanburg, we have a big problem, somewhat at Donaldson, but definitely at Greenville, it's really difficult to get the visual on that runway if you're VFR at nighttime, even with the landing lights on. And next slide, please, Melanie. Okay, here's an overlay of the airspace. As you can see, GMU or downtown Greenville is right underneath Class C airspace. So the possibilities of getting a GMU without going Class C is possible, but most of the time people are flying through Class C to get to downtown Greenville. And then people may know, the folks over at the TRACON at GSP have landlines to all the airports here. So when traffic's coming in, they usually call them up on the landline and tell them, hey, you got some traffic coming in, it's who they are, what they are. They can usually see it on the radar as well. Because the good news is GMU has radar, so they can definitely see what's going on and provide some pretty good services out there. And next slide, Melanie. Okay, some of the VFR waypoints and talk about here. The one they look is Saluda Lake, Pickens Speedway, and the gravel pit. So want to add to any more, Sarah, as far as some VFR waypoints if you're coming in from the west to downtown?
Typically, we'll use Furman as well. It's a middle point between Saluda Lake and Paris Mountain. If you're overflying Paris Mountain, it's pretty hard to stay out of the Charlie. Just to get over the mountain and under the Charlie is a very thin line to thread there. So Furman is a good waypoint too, and it's just in the middle there between Saluda Lake and Paris Mountain.
Okay, good. All right, good. And next slide, Melanie. Okay, here are the letters of internal letters of agreement between the two airports here. It talks about aircraft giving out agreement with downtown Class D airspace. Aircraft transitioning out of GMU airspace to the southern GMU. Due to the large number of aircraft landing on runway 4. And this is where it gets interesting, okay? Because what happens is you've got runway 4 is right there at the bottom end of downtown Greenville. And due to the large number of aircraft landing on runway 4 at Greenville Spartanburg Airport, GSP, VFR aircraft not requesting flight following from GSP approach are requested/suggested to remain below 2,000 feet until they're clear of the GSP runway 4 final approach. And the next indication, next slide there, Melanie, we can see that. This is actually from TRACON. And you can see there that you've got Moldy and you've got the ILS runway 4 coming in. Moldy is actually going to be the final approach fix. It's about 5 miles in there on that final approach fix. So if you're coming out of Chandel or you're flying, you know, even if the bottom there is 2,200 feet, if you're flying at 2,000 feet, you can duck under Class C and then talk directly to GMU. What I've been told is that when aircraft are coming in on the ILS runway 4 into downtown or into GSP, and they have aircraft flying underneath them at 2,000 feet, it sets off alarms in their cockpit. And so that requires paperwork, okay? So why was there, you know, a situation where you came in close conflict with an aircraft? Because if you're coming in over Moldy, you know, Moldy down is probably around about 2,500 feet if you're down at that altitude. So you're about 500 feet above this airplane. So if you get aircraft flying below you at 500 feet, it's going to set off all sorts of alarms in these commercial aircraft. However, that's what's going on with that today. That's what they're requesting us to do with the letter of agreement. And the next slide, please, Melanie. Here's some indications here. What I want to bring your attention to now is a little thing called VPLOW. VPLOW looks like a little GPS waypoint there. That's been probably around about a year and a half now, and it was actually created between the controllers over at GSP in conjunction with the guys at Donaldson and GMU. And what it is a GSP waypoint in the middle there that they like to have traffic leaving GMU go to if they're flying anywhere to the south first. Because what that does, that keeps them out of that corridor. Because the closer they get towards Moldy, the more problems it comes. So VPLOW has become a very important waypoint, definitely for departing traffic at a GMU. The next slide, Emily. And this is what it looks like. VPLOW to the south, Moldy, there's the outer marker. And that's what they're looking between, 2,000 feet between there. So to get aircraft away from Moldy, to get aircraft away to the further south, out of that 2,000 feet corridor, what's been happening is GMU has been requesting pilots to go to VPLOW. And Sarah, any discussions around that for your students or what you've been hearing over at the tower there at
Tower encourages anybody going to the south or southeast to utilize VPLOW or to pick up flight following. If you are on the ground at Greenville, when you ask for your departure, instead of requesting a departure to the west or north, east, just request a VPLOW departure, and they will grant it to you. I've never heard them deny it to anybody. And it's as simple as typing in Victor Papa Lima Oscar Whiskey in your GPS, and it'll take you there. Just be sure you remain at or below the 2,000 feet there. They're more than happy to issue that to you at any time.
Yeah, and that keeps you out of the way for traffic arriving on runway 4. So that's a very, very important tool to use. So if you don't have a GPS in your airplane, you're going to find that VPLOW is actually going to be on your VFR sectionals. It's actually indicated as a waypoint on there too. So there's definitely information on how to attain it. And I believe, for those who are interested, it's actually over Freddy's Pizza. So actually Googled it to find out if there was some type of ground reference that you could tell somebody, this is how you might find VPLOW even with GPS, and you're going to find Freddy's Pizza. So hopefully you won't be flying that low to identify a pizza restaurant. And next slide, Melanie.
Terry, if I may, we've got a question on VPLOW. Someone's asking to describe the VPLOW waypoint northeast of Donaldson and south-southeast of GMU. What is it? How to use it? How not to use it? And then also, is Moldy really an outer marker or just a waypoint?
Okay, so I did the Moldy, I did Sarah did the VPLOW. Moldy is actually an outer marker reference point, or the final approach fix. That's usually about 5 miles out. Here is probably about 5.5 miles out because on the localizer, on a very long runway at GSP. Typically Moldy, once you pass Moldy, that's your final approach fix to land, and you'll be descending quite rapidly onto the runway there. And that's what Moldy is, an outer marker and the final approach fix. Either going to be that for the localizer or the ILS. That's what Moldy is. And Sarah, VPLOW?
So VPLOW is a VFR waypoint where Moldy is used in an instrument approach. VPLOW is for all pilots, for visual flight rule pilots. There's really not a wrong way to use VPLOW unless you exceed that 2,000 feet, and then you're just in the way there. But you can arrive into Greenville via VPLOW. Again, just be sure you're below the 2,000 feet, and I would hopefully be talking to Greenville Tower by that point. But most of the time it's used for departures out of GMU. If you're going to the south or southeast, it keeps you from having to track all the way around to the west and then down south of Donaldson and then to your destination.
Okay. And we're going to go ahead and show some of those illustrations in a bit. Very good. And okay, so let's imagine then we're taking off from runway 1 out of downtown Greenville. And northbound talks about, the good news is you fly straight out at or below 3,099 feet. And that's the most used runway. So if you're departing from GMU, this is the most used runway. And if you're going north, good news is it's pretty much less airspace in front of you. And you're going to go to VPLOW, you go straight out. Any comments, Sarah, on that?
No, that works well. We typically for training we'll go to the northwest or directly out to the west. But as long as you're staying out of the Charlie there, at or below the 3,100, that's keeping everybody happy.
Yep. Next slide. This gives you an indication how it looks. So if you're flying straight out, there it is. You're flying straight out, and once you get, good altitude, then you can contact the rear and then clear through their airspace. The important thing is, as Sarah pointed out, no higher than 31, or in this case, 3099. So a pretty straightforward departure, VFR departure. Okay, next slide. All right, now we're taking off runway 1 here again. This time we're going to go south, west, or eastbound. So what will happen is here, it'll be a left or downwind departure. So again, you're in a control tower. Don't be surprised. You have to do a left or downwind, depending on what's going on. You have to stay, as Sarah pointed out, at or below 2,000 feet and proceed to VPLOW on course. And that's how it's going to work. And Sarah, any preference you see that they give us more of a left downwind departure or more of a right downwind departure? What do you normally see there, runway 1, GMU?
Even though runway 1 at GMU is a left traffic runway, they typically give a right downwind departure just for ease of getting to V-plow. I don't know if I've had a left downwind get into V-plow, but like you said, it depends on traffic and depends on what's going on. But typically they try to make everything easy for the pilot. They're great about that. They're very helpful to us. But most of the time off of runway 1, if you're using V-plow, expect a right downwind departure.
Okay, good. And the next slide gives an illustration of how that looks. As you can see here, left or right, mostly right, as Sarah pointed out, a little bit easier to head down that way to V-plow. And once you get to V-plow, you pretty much go your left or right, or east or west or south, heading there. Okay. All right, next one. All right, now we're to runway 19, looking straight down the south here. As you can see here, pretty straightforward on the southwest, east, or northbound, runway heading to V-plow before proceeding on course at or below 2000. This is the one-way street, and you pretty much got to go to V-plow before doing anything else. So, Sarah, any comments on that?
No, like you said, this is really the easier runway to use. Not that runway 1 is difficult for V-plow, but if the wind is favoring 19 is nice because it's just a slight left turn on course there to V-plow.
Okay, yep. Next slide, Melanie. Okay, as you see here, you're heading straight down there, all the way down the bottom there. And once you get to V-plow, you can pretty much turn left or right, any direction what you want to go. Okay. And next slide. There's a little corridor there again, 2,000 feet. Okay, now we're going to talk about runway 28. Both north and south departures remain clear of GSP Class C airspace, then proceed on course. So again, you're heading out of the west now, pretty much heading in a westerly heading here, runway 28. Again, you're climbing out to at or below 3,099 feet here. So that's pretty much it. And Sarah, any comments on that? Pretty straightforward. I guess you go to Pickens, right? That's where everyone goes. The flight training.
Yeah, Pickens is very popular. We actually don't use 28 very much. It's a little shorter. It's got that displaced threshold, a little skinnier. So 90% of the time, I'd say we're on runway 1 and 19.
Yep. Okay, next one. As you can see, straight out, and there she goes. And you can head straight out there, either direction, north or south. And again, you're nice and clear of any issues with Class C airspace and moving out there. Okay, next one, Melanie. Okay, this is runway 10, and this is what's known as the lesser used runway. And one of the issues that as you can see there on the right-hand side, they've got issues with the runway safety area or taxiway clearances. So from a design perspective, they don't very rarely use this runway. And I think, Sarah, how many times have you used this runway since you've been out there at GMU?
Maybe 20 times.
How many years? 2 or 3 years, maybe? Quite a while.
1 on 3.
Yeah. So as you can see here, again, this is the problem with this one. They only use it unless it's a 10-knot wind from the east or greater than 10 knot east from the west. And the issues are the runway safety area, and then you're taking off right into career flight paths. And if you go ahead and you see, if used, you can immediately turn to heading on 030 and then climb to 3,000 or 3,100 feet. And the word immediate is immediate. And the next slide there, Melanie, we can see why. Taking off out of there, you're pretty much going to be, heading into a career airspace pretty promptly if you don't turn off very quickly there. So that's kind of an issue and a catch-all there to worry about too. Okay, and next slide. So the question is then, what happens if you go out there and have a violation where you bust one of these airspaces? Such deviation could result in loss of separation. And the dreaded conversation you'll have with ATC is they will say there's a possible, airspace or pilot violation, and they're trying to give you a phone number. And the idea is that when you land, you go speak to the supervisor at ATC and explain exactly what happened. Well, the first thing is, I say, pilots don't go out and say, I'm going to go out and commit a pilot deviation today. I mean, they're not going to go out and deliberately do that. Or I'm going to fly through some airspace because I'm not supposed to. They're not going to do that. Pilot deviations occur because of poor technique, inattention, or failure to plan properly. Because again, we mentioned before, the 91103, you're responsible for the outcome of the flight. So if you're in the wrong frequency, or you don't know where you are, or what you're doing, and you create a situation where you bust an airspace, that's called a pilot deviation. So what happens with the pilot deviation? Let's go to the next slide, Melanie. So the idea is that ATC are going to try and provide you understanding of exactly where you are. And I tell my students that if an ATC gives you these two key numbers, they give you an altimeter setting and a heading or an altitude, you read it back, write it down, understand it, exactly what they say, because it's those numbers that will keep you out of the wrong place. If you don't write things down, don't repeat it back, or don't understand it, there's a possibility you'll be ending up in the wrong airspace. So think about it, what pilots should do before they fly. And the next slide then, Melanie. Remember these things. So I mentioned before then, there's the 9103, responsibility and authority pilot in command. The next one is pre-flight action. So there's certain things that could catch you, right? It talks about, think about these induced gotchas. Let's go to the very first one that could cause a problem. No pre-flight planning. So imagine somebody flying up to the Upstate for the very first time and not spending any time looking at the charts of what's going on up here. Especially if they're a student pilot, an experienced pilot, some of the problems they may have to get up here. That could very easily cause a pilot deviation. Next slide. Out-of-date charts. They've got some charts they've had a few years ago. There's things on there that are out of date, cause a problem. How about not having any charts? That could be a problem, right? So those type of things could also be a situation where you don't really know what's really going on with the airspace, and having out-of-date charts or no charts could definitely cause a problem. The next slide, Melanie. Not using available information resources. Okay, lots of information out there. And what's neat about it now, all these new, technology out there with these iPads and things you can get with ForeFlight and Garmix and WingX, those type of things, all the information is very, very accessible to pilots to use and look at. So there's no really any excuse that the information wasn't available. It's out there, you have to dig for it and look for it, but it's definitely worth looking at to keep you safe without having this pilot deviation situation. Next slide, Melanie. Not reviewing airport layout, and I'll let Sarah talk about this. GMU is a busy airport. They have 2 runways, lots of traffic coming in and out. And what happens is they may have a couple of what's called hotspots on the runway and some other issues there. So Sarah, talk about some of the challenges that you see now at GMU in a busy airport, people not really knowing where they're going, or turning off on the wrong intersection, or turning onto a runway. I know the controllers have a bit of an issue with that.
I'll start by saying that our controllers are very patient, and they work with instructors and student pilots and visiting pilots, so they're very helpful. You just have to let them know that you need help. Very few people request progressive taxis, whether they're taxiing to the runway or trying to taxi to parking. It could prevent a good bit of trouble that we see on the ground. Also, like you said, using your resources and doing that pre-flight PIC action that's required before your departure, just knowing where to go, getting familiar with hotspots, getting familiar with which ramp you're wanting to use or wanting to tie down at. And I think a good bit of the things that we see could be prevented there.
Yep, good, okay. Next slide, Melanie. Yeah, it's a good one. Not just doing NOTAMs. It's pretty embarrassing arriving in an airport to find out the runway's closed. So that's not good. So again, it's looking at the NOTAMs, making sure that you know what is operational. Here at Spartanburg Downtown Airport, we don't have any PAPI lights right now, and our glide slope's out. And if you fly in here, definitely, especially if you're flying IFR, the controllers will always tell you, be aware that PAPIs are out and there's no glide slope. So they're even telling you that on the actual arrival situation here at this particular airport. So the information's out there, the controllers are telling you these things, but making sure that you do some research to find out exactly what's going on at these airports. I mean, again, there could be no fuel, the credit card machine's down, there's a crane on the end of the runway, you know, all sorts of things are going to be there. So again, NOTAMs are going to tell you about what to expect to look out for. Letters of agreement, again, looking at what the agreement is between the airports and how they operate together. Again, that's the agreement between how the airports, even though there's standard procedures, because what's going on is unique or it's become a problem, they've come up with these internal letters of agreement that's unique to those airports only. So it's not generic, it's just unique to those airports. And obviously then the TFRs, making sure that you know what's going on with that. And Sarah, I'll talk about Clemson. I know that lots of TFRs are going on at the game area there. Do you want to add any input to that, flying on the area over there, especially during the busy season, during the football games?
Yeah, we do several training flights out to Clemson, just practicing navigation prior to the cross-country stage. But when those TFRs are out, it's, again, really on you as pilot in command to look at that. Our ATIS really only focuses on what's going on at our airport. Like you mentioned, there's a crane nearby GMU now, and that's on our ATIS. But aside from that, just do your homework before you take off, and that can prevent a good bit.
Yeah. Okay, next slide, Melanie. Here's a good one, setting the wrong radio frequency. No one's done that before. You know, these radios, the fat fingers, reading what you thought you put in there, could have dire consequences, right? Because you're not transmitting on the right frequency you think you are. And that can really cause problems. So you really want to check and double check and make sure you get the right frequency on here. And also, some of these radios are getting old, and some of these LEDs not as bright as they used to be. Some of us are getting older and wearing glasses. So again, it can be very easily done. It's very easy to set the wrong frequency in the radio and not be communicating with anybody. And you're flying around in the Upstate up here in the busy, congested area, cause all sorts of problems. Next slide, Melanie. Here's a good one, setting the altimeter correctly. All right, again, when you talk to any controller, there's flight following or even an IFR flight plan, they will give you the altimeter setting. They want to make sure you are where you're supposed to be. And if you're flying through multi-layers of different altitudes, especially in the Upstate, you want to make sure you are exactly where you're supposed to be. And you're going to make sure you double check those numbers. And if you're hearing other people in the area getting the altimeter setting, check yours as well to make sure it's correct, because that could catch you very easily. Especially taking off out of GMU and you set that incorrectly. As you take off, you can inadvertently climb through an airspace you didn't realize you was in. Sarah, has that happened out there at GMU, do you think?
I'm sure it has. Again, just do your homework, and it can check and double check, triple check, quadruple check. I'm sure I've done it, you know, but our air traffic control and the ATC over at Greer, they're very helpful to everybody. They're very understanding. They know that there's a lot of training going on at Greenville, at Spartanburg, at Donaldson. So they're very accommodating, which is nice.
Yeah. Okay, next slide, Melanie. So let's talk about the other half of the team. Sarah talks about the controllers. Some controllers fly, most of them don't, I've found out. So I've offered many times to take controllers flying to see the other side, you know, to see how the other side looks. But as Sarah pointed out, these are professionals, they're highly professional, they're very, what they do is a very important job, and they have to keep it safe. Let's talk about their team, some of the responsibilities. So next slide, Emily. So the primary concern is safety. That's the number one thing. They're going to make sure that everyone stays safe. They're looking out for the errors, they're looking out for the mistakes, they're looking out for the student pilots. Let's itemize some of these things. Go ahead and go through the list here. So to manage air traffic in an effective manner, okay, communicating properly, developing methods, logistics, and controlling air traffic effectively, prevent accidents and collisions with an aircraft, looking for encourage and pursue safety of passengers and crew of all time, especially on the ground even. And understand and visualize where planes are and are located. That's a real skill in doing that. Start to understand the location, the traction, the route of the various aircraft, the sequence airplanes in, extending downwinds, base, different types of landing configurations. Totally understand the last minute changes in flight schedules to act accordingly, be flexible and those type of things. And maintain communications with the aircraft crew and ground control in an accurate, precise manner. So these are basically a job description to an air traffic controller. And so these are the things that they do to keep us safe. And we're going to make sure that as a pilot, this is their job, and as our job is to make sure that we work with them and keep that resource and airspace safe. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I want to talk about this. So after the deviation, there's a program called NASA. It's called the Aviation Safety Reporting System, or NASA. So what happens is, if you go out there and inadvertently do something that became a safety issue, whether that was inadvertently flying through some airspace you shouldn't have done, or you didn't set the altimeter correctly and actually busted the airspace at a GNU into maybe Greer, or for instance, you didn't get the right radio frequency on, all those type of things. There's the opportunity to go online to this particular program here and fill out this reporting system. What it is, the key point is that it's a voluntary thing. It's a way that you can voluntarily submit an incident or report that can come from pilots or air traffic controllers or dispatchers or flight attendants, maintenance technicians or others. And by submitting these reports, describes an unsafe occurrence or a hazard situation. What this group does, it takes all the information back and they look to see if there are any trends in this safety reporting. Because that way they can figure out, we've got an issue here. This is the third time or the fifth time it's become a problem. And what they do is they take the information and bring it to the surface and make things like this fasting presentation, talk about known issues that are going on right now in general aviation. That's one of the reasons why we have it. And next slide, Melanie. So there's two ways you can do it. You can actually go ahead and print it out and fill it out. But the best way to do it is fill it out online. And so the biggest important thing is here, the FAA considers that filling out the report with NASA is indicative and a constructive attitude. They believe making the report will tend to prevent future violations. Okay? Although eventually they find you have committed a violation, because the FAA is going to find out, because maybe the controller may tell them that this plane was involved in some type of pilot deviation. The FAA will not impose a certificate inspection if the violation was an accident. It was deliberate. So if you put in there, yeah, I screwed up, I didn't put the right altimeter setting, or I fat fingered the radio, those type of things, and they see that no criminal action was done with the last 5 years of the report, then you are going to be pretty much off the hook, okay? Because what happens is every time there's an incident, the FAA gets about it, they have to make an investigation. But if you do some type of report like this to this particular group, it protects you in some way to make sure that you realize you made a mistake, you won't forget it, and you actually reported it. It shows them that you're trying to help the situation by making sure they understood that you knew you made a mistake and it was an accident, it wasn't deliberate. So very, very good program to get involved with if you get involved with that. Okay, next slide. So, sharing our resources. Basically, it's working as a team to arrive safely. So, as I mentioned then out there, there's lots of information out there to make sure we fly safely in these airspaces. It's our job as pilots to make sure that we gather all the right information and we double check our radios, our altimeter settings to make sure we're where we're supposed to be. Do some research on what's going on in these type of situations before we arrive. Review airport layouts. Again, do your homework before you turn up, and that way you won't come across having a pilot deviation. But Sarah, any words before we close tonight?
I would highly encourage using flight following anytime you're in or around the area, just to have an extra set of eyes on you, because it is very busy, tons of traffic going into all three airports at Greenville. So they can keep an extra eye on you, and it can keep you from getting a deviation. If they clear you into the Charlie, you might get a more direct route. I saw a question earlier about going from Clemson to the east. If you just request flight following, they're very accommodating, more than happy to help you. They'll give you a 4-digit squawk and maybe a couple headings to turn to, but aside from that, it's it's a great resource. I don't think it's utilized enough. I don't think it's taught enough, unfortunately. Some people seem a little timid or almost afraid of it, but they are there to help. So I would encourage using that a little more.
Yep, right. So Melanie, let's go ahead and open the questions. Any questions coming in, we'll go ahead and answer them best we can.
Absolutely. We've got quite a few questions, so I'll go ahead and just try to group them together by airport. We've got, we're going to start with Donaldson. How does Donaldson keep traffic departing on 5 from conflicting with VPLOW bound aircraft coming from GMU?
Sarah, can you give one?
Typically when they're departing from 5, even if they're going to the east, they'll get an initial turn to the left. That's just because that class Charlie is there. And when they're departing off of 5, they're basically heading right into GSP. So just out of the departures that I've seen, they usually get a slight turn to the left. And I would assume that was put in place there to help reduce any type of collision with those VPLOW departures from Greenville as well.
Another good point is that if you're taking off from Donaldson and you do plan to go into Charlie Airspace, try and get a squawk code on the ground before you leave. So you call up the Donaldson Tower and tell them you'd like to get a code over to Spartanburg. And what they will do, they will actually call Greer, get the code and give it to you. So you have it. So when you take off, you got a squawk code, and then you can transition. And the guys in Class C know you're coming, and then they can see you coming in. So it saves a bit of time. So again, getting a squawk code on the ground at Donaldson can be very helpful. Okay, next question.
All right. Staying with Donaldson, from the charts, how would we know that Donaldson has no radar?
You wouldn't, unfortunately. So I didn't know that. So when I went around to these airports and was asking these questions about them, they quickly pointed out to me, we don't have any radar here. I said, okay. So, you know, it's not something that's actually widely advertised. But if you ever ask Donaldson about that, they'll very quickly tell you that. If you ever go to their tower, they have binoculars, some phones, a pretty good view of things. It's interesting because they get a lot of military out of there. So I think it's a funding issue or maybe a cost issue, but it's a good question. But Donaldson were the very first ones to tell you that they've got no radar there.
Staying with Donaldson again, taking off to the north, do you suggest turning before reaching the far end of the runway as soon as you reach 500 feet?
Yeah, so yeah, again, you know, hopefully that runway's pretty long. Sarah can chime in here. You should be able to get 500 feet above the ground before you get to the end of the runway. Sarah, I mean.
Yeah, I think it's about 8,000 feet. I don't have the chart in front of me to look at, but as soon as you hit that safe 500 feet AGL and are able to, again, safely make that turn, I would highly recommend it just to keep you from encroaching too tight on any other airspace.
Right. Yep.
All right. Moving to GMU, when departing GMU to the north with no intention of penetrating Class C airspace, is it still advisable to notify GSP control of your intentions?
Sarah?
I would. Most of the time, honestly, if you call for a departure to the north out of GMU, they kind of encourage you to get flight following. They'll offer it to you several times on the ground. Are you sure you don't want flight following? We can put it in the system for you. And that, again, it's not so they can, you know, watch your every move, but it's to keep you safe. It's to make their job easier, to make your job as a pilot easier. So it takes maybe 30 additional seconds on the ground to pick it up. I would encourage it. You certainly don't have to. Again, like Terry said, it's completely optional. But just for your safety, you can never be too safe. But for your safety and for their ease of access to you if they need you, then it wouldn't hurt to pick it up.
Okay.
All right. And let's see, what does it mean when GMU says fly to the numbers?
Head straight for the runway. Straight for the number. They say that all the time, and I didn't know as a student pilot what they meant either. Just if they have you on a dog leg or a base or anywhere kind of off center, they just want you to get to the runway basically not as quickly as you can, but in the most direct line that you can.
Excellent. And where does the VFR only pilot find hotspot descriptions?
So you're going to find those. There's a book called the Airport Supplement. It's a green book. It's also downloadable on ForeFlight, I imagine WingX. And in there, there's diagrams of some airports. A very good resource also is AOPA, and there's a website. You can go ahead and pull up the airport diagrams from that, download them, print them. And what you'll notice is that on these airport diagrams, there'll be circles with HS on there, and we talk about the hotspots. And hotspots really are where there's been possible, deviation to the past, where there's confusion between two cross runways or two taxiways, or a very complex type of situation where you may have a conflict. But I would recommend, without any cost, you go to the AOP website, pull up an airport, pull up Raleigh, maybe RDU, for instance, and you can find the airport diagram on there, and it will show you where the hotspots are, and you can print it out. It's great to take with you if you're arriving at an airport you're unfamiliar with.
And then just a couple comments here. One attendee says at Clemson on game day, tower monitors 122.7 and will direct incoming transmission on the wrong frequency to the tower frequency, just so for everyone's information. And then here's a great one. What's the history of these airports? Who was there first between GSP, GMU, and Donaldson? Who said, hey, I have a great idea. Let's put another airport 6 nautical miles away from the nearest one?
So I'll tell you what I know. So as the airport director of Spartanburg, we are the very first commercial airport in South Carolina. So Spartanburg was actually here first, right? Saying it. So we had Lindbergh out here. We had the Mail coming out here in 1927. I believe during the same time, maybe in the 30s, downtown Greenville, as some type of competition, had an airport as well. And obviously you can see where it is today. In 1961, they decided that they needed to build an airport to accommodate much larger traffic. So rather than saying, okay, we'll give it to Spartanburg or Greenville, they built Greer. So in 1963, they took all the commercial traffic, such as Eastern, Piedmont, and others, away from those two airports and located them over at GSP, which then made basically GMU and then Spartanburg general aviation airports. I believe Donaldson is also a very old airport, but I think Donaldson was predominantly a military airport initially. And for those who know, the control tower over Triple Tree, just south of us here, actually came from the Donaldson airport. It's an actual old control tower, so military control tower. So then a military background, but I think it was the development of a decision to make Greer or Greenville-Spartanburg the main airport, and the reason they put it there. So much longer runway. But I guess back then in the 60s, all that was pretty rural, so it wasn't a big deal in building it.
All right, and with a general shout out to GMU for the Runway Cafe also on that comment. We're going to stick with GMU just for some clarification on flight of the numbers. Someone asks, so flight of the numbers means there will be no base leg aligned with the runway. You will turn at the numbers to align with the runway heading. Is that correct?
At that point, they're probably just trying to sequence you in a little quicker instead of having you on a 3-mile base. It might say fly to the numbers, just basically telling you to throw your traffic pattern to the wind and aim for the numbers on the runway in a safe manner. Of course, you wouldn't want to do anything that you're uncomfortable with. And you can always tell them you're unable if you're not comfortable with doing that, if you'd rather have a full base and full final. But normally they do that for sequencing. They've got somebody else coming in and you're going to meet about the same time. So I would assume that's what they were doing there.
All right, thank you. It looks like it's about it for questions.
Okay. Well, thank everyone joining tonight. Hopefully you found this presentation interesting. You learned something from it. I encourage you to continue attending these FAST team meetings. As you can see, we're doing it in Zoom, and the past we do in phase, but because of what's going on, this seems to be the most best way to do it, safest way to do it. I want to thank Sarah for joining me tonight and helping me out with this presentation. I enjoyed having her expertise, especially with the downtown Greenville Airport. And Mary, I'd like to thank you also for helping us host this. And without any further questions, I wish everyone a good evening and safe flying.